So as I started preparing for this class, and by the way, we're not going to be dealing with Tehillim today. We're not going to be dealing with Psalms. I was looking into things about the Sukkot holiday, the holiday of Sukkot in Israeli Hebrew, and that got me off on a completely different tangent and a completely different direction. But we're going to go today. Look, it's a holiday. It's a special time, special subjects, so it's an exception to the rule, okay? I hope everyone's all right with that. So, it's also interesting that one of my friends from synagogue, asked me, I was telling him about the studies we do together, and he said to me, well, are you teaching them about the 7 laws of Noah? And it's the funniest thing that I discovered a fascinating connection between one of the more unique of the 7 laws and the holiday of Sukkot, holiday of Sukkot. And this is how it all began. I was thinking to myself, where is the first time that the Torah mentions the word Sukkot? Where is it? So the first time is in Bereshit, Genesis, in the 33rd chapter, verse 17. I believe this is the first time it's ever mentioned. If I'm wrong, tell me, prove me wrong if I'm wrong, but I'm quite certain this is it. So it says there that Jacob journeyed to Sukkot and built himself a house, and for his livestock he made Sukkot. He therefore called the name of the place Sukkot. Okay? So, but we need some more background. We have to flesh this out a little bit, what the story is. So we're in Parshas Vayishlach. We're in the Torah portion discussing the encounter between Esau and Yaakov, between Jacob and Esau. And we'll get back to that in a moment. Anyway, as they depart and they go their own ways, so Esau returns to his home in Seir, and Jacob, he proceeds along his journey, and he reaches a place called Sukkot. And there, why is it called Sukkot? Because he builds a house there. He builds a sukkah, a shelter for his sheep and for his livestock. So I noticed that in the commentaries, not much is really said about this, but the very famous and holy commentator who is known as the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, Rav Chaim Atar, he was a Kabbalist, lived around the time of the Holy Ari, approximately, I believe, in Israel, centuries ago. And he writes, he asked a question, I should say. So, well, why did this place get named Sukkot? Why? Why did it get this name? I mean, what was so special about this? They called it shelter, and they called it, bamboo-covered booth. I mean, what's the big deal? Why did they call it this name? Why did Yaakov call it this name? Why did Jacob call it this name? So he answers, he says that this was something really very unusual, that shepherds and attendants of livestock did not build shelters for their animals. They were left to, graze out in the wild, and they slept out there. Again, you can imagine that the land of Israel is in the Mesopotamian area, and the weather is it's mild. It can get very hot, it can get cool, but it doesn't really go to the far extremes. And they just didn't shelter the animals. The livestock were left outside, particularly sheep, goats, and the like. They were kept outside. So this was something so unique that the whole area was named after what Jacob did in that place. So I was thinking to myself, that is so fascinating. So the word sukkah is first used in relation to kindness to animals. That's the first time that it's used. Isn't that something? That's so fascinating. And obviously we know that generally it's counted as the 7th mitzvah of the 7 of Noahide laws is not to cut off and consume the limb of a living animal, which implies an entire category of relationship with nature and with particularly with other sentient creatures on God's earth. So it's unbelievable that the first time Sukkah is mentioned is referring to this very, very important, unique mitzvah that sometimes is I think is a little bit, it's sometimes not paid sufficient attention to. Everybody knows, that you can't steal, murder, and so on and so forth. Prayer, faith, but animals, the natural world. What about that? So I want to discuss that entire mitzvah with you in terms of its application to the Ben Noach, to all peoples of the world, in particular those who want to be careful and meticulous in this mitzvah. It's such an important, wonderful mitzvah. But I also want to answer, what does it have to do with the sukkah? Because, although according to the simple interpretation, the reason why the verse says sukkah here is simply because he built them such a structure. But let's go deeper. Why this word? And we know what a sukkah is. So it seems to bear relationship to the mitzvah. But in what way? How? I also, as I was reviewing this whole event here, this whole story in the Chumash, it occurred to me an unbelievable thing. We know that as a general rule, Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, or as we say in the more Yiddish Hebrew, Ma'aseh Avot is Siman Labanim. What does this mean? The acts of the fathers, particularly the forefathers, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, they are a symbol and also really a catalyst and an example of the future of the children, of what's going to happen to the children of Israel in the future, and also, by extension, the world. So, believe it or not, in this story, I believe, and I like to suggest, I didn't see it in a source anywhere, but I like to suggest that this ending here is the end of days. This story of the Sukkah is implying the end of days, and I'll tell you exactly why. Let's go back now. How does this whole story begin? So, Jacob leaves Laban, right? The Aramite leaves that country and he begins his journey home. And on the way, his brother, who hates his guts because of the blessings, because of jealousy, and so on and so forth, is looking to kill him, and he's following him with 400 men, and there's an entire story there, right? So Jacob prepares in three ways. He prepares with prayer, he prepares with battle and gifts for his brother. But before his brother comes, a fascinating thing happens. Jacob leaves the camp. He ventures back over a river in order to save some utensils that were left behind. The verse says in chapter 32 in Genesis, verse 25, Vayivaseh Yaakov levado, vayavek ishimo ad alos hashachar. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. So our sages say that, why was he alone? Because he went back to collect some utensils, vessels, some of his possessions that were left behind. And while he was there, he meets a man and they enter into a struggle. Our sages say, who is this man? This is the angel of Esav. He's basically the antithesis of Jacob. He's the evil inclination incarnate, so to speak. I think in a deeper level, or if we want to understand this in its proper form, Jacob was having a spiritual battle. To whatever extent it may have manifested in a physical form or not, I can't exactly tell you. But from the fact that our sages say that this was an arch evil angel, this was a spiritual battle. This wasn't really a physical battle. It was a spiritual one. And they fought until what time? Until the dawn. they wrestled, right? So finally, Jacob vanquishes this angel at the dawn. By the way, the dawn alludes to what? Messianic era, the end of days, right? Particularly the Messianic era. It's the beginning of the light, right, of the end. There's a dark night of the exile, then there's the dawn. So Jacob and this angel wrestle the entire exile, meaning as in Hasidus it speaks about so often, that the battle with the evil inclination, a person's mostly really internal battle, but obviously with all the forces of evil contrary to Torah that exist in the world, primarily that takes place during the exile. And then towards dawn, so then the righteous, the children of Israel, they'll be victorious at the end. Now, after that it talks about Vayiga b'kaf Yerecho, V'tika chaf Yerech Yaakov. So it says that, looking at the English, says when he perceived that he could not overcome him, meaning that this angel couldn't overcome Jacob, he struck the socket of his hip. So Jacob's hip socket was dislocated as he wrestled with him. I believe this is an allusion to the fact that a human being can only fight evil so far. And then whatever is left, God has to do the rest. We can do the job only so far, and then we need divine assistance in order to bring about the full eradication of evil from the world, which again is really the Messianic age. We can remove as best we can negative traits from ourselves, negative behaviors, feelings and beliefs from ourselves, control negative lusts and passions, but in the end, and we can even fix the world around us, bring more sensitivity to those around us, and influence them, and bring godliness to our whole surroundings. But in the end, the full rectification must come from God. And I believe that's one of the illusions of this hip, is that something is left for God. We can't do it all. And we know the story then. It goes on to say that he will bless him. And after this story, Jacob returns, and then he meets his brother. And you'd expect, this shootout. You'd expect some kind of action movie to go on, but that doesn't happen. Esau embraces Jacob. They get along, and Esau starts asking him, let's go together. I mean, it's unbelievable. What happened? This is the brother that hated him. This is the brother that brought 400 men to murder him. And now he's trying to work with them. I mean, we know that Jacob sent him many gifts to appease him, but still, so what? So what? Why did he become so easily appeased? So, one of the great Hasidic masters, Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, of all places, was a known hub of a Jewish community centuries ago, Chernobyl. And he was one of the Hasidic masters, one of the students of the Maggid, the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. He says that we should know that all the enemies around us, they stem from a spiritual problem that we have. They stem from a spiritual enemy that we've left to fester. And if we overcome that evil, that contrariness to God, that enemy would melt away. That enemy would turn to be our friend, disappear. And that's what happened, I believe, over here. Yaakov fights the spiritual battle first. To whatever extent there was something, Jacob, he was elevated and grew so much during his time with Laban. To the extent that he was completely aware of who and what he needed to fight. That itself is very difficult, ladies and gentlemen. Just to figure out what it is we need to fix in life. We just went through a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. I know you joined us. And we're talking about, particularly on Yom Kippur, we're talking about we've sinned this, we've sinned that, we've done wrong. And sometimes we sit and think, we're not really clear. It's all fuzzy. How does this relate to me? We may know one or two things, but I always think about a statement I once saw from another Hasidic master, the Rabbi Elimelech of Lazensk. May his merit, great merit, protect us. He says that when a person really comes to a full, really blessed by God, this is what he says. He says when a person really breaks through with a feeling of repentance and yearning for God, where he breaks through something where he actually reaches a place where a window opens, he says, and suddenly he sees all the wrongdoings of his life. So you think, that's terrible. That's horrible. That's a good thing. That's what you're working towards? Yeah, that's what you're working towards. You're working to your eyes to be open. What am I doing wrong? In what way am I completely off and I'm not even aware of it? What things am I doing in my life contrary to Torah? Maybe even just the way my ego. Maybe something about the way I am as a person is something off. Maybe in my faith there's something off. Sometimes they're just things we completely ignore. That they're there, they're right, it's like the elephant in the room. But we just don't see it. We have to have the merit to see those things. It takes a lot of prayer. It takes a lot of, a lot of pleading with God to open our eyes. And I believe the meaning of this battle between Jacob and the angel is that Jacob was the epitome of that. He completely had an awareness of his enemy, that it was literally embodied in front of him. He knew this was. It's unbelievable. And he defeats, or at least to almost, not quite, there's a little bit left there, but this enemy is forced to bless him. And because of that, because he succeeds and basically subdues his spiritual enemy, and his spiritual enemy has to bless him, so too his physical enemy does exactly the same thing. His physical enemy wants to help him, wants to assist him. Come along with me, let's go together. Completely forgot about the issue with the blessings, like it never happened. He came to kill him, he forgot the whole thing. Unbelievable. So, and after this story, so Esav goes on his way, and Yaakov, what does Yaakov do? Yaakov then deals with his animals. Interesting. That's the next thing, is he deals with his animals. So let's think this through on the macro level, because Jacob's story here is an embodiment of the story of the Jewish people and those in mankind that are assisting them on this path. And what is that? First, there's our own spiritual battles, our own personal spiritual battles, ourselves to rectify and purify ourselves, our own character, our body, best we can, our family and our possessions around us, who we come in contact with. And then after that, so that spreads out from level to level, basically. Personal, communal, familiar, communal, and then national in the world. So what we're talking about here is a situation in which this is brought to such a perfection that the nations who are enemies of the Jewish people, the enemies of God, of Torah, they make amends, right? So we're talking about an end-of-days situation in which that the nations make peace with Israel. They want to assist them. That's what Esav is saying here. He goes back on his way, but his way is now different. It's not the same way as it was before. Right? Of course, if it would be really the end of days, then they wouldn't go off separate ways. Then they'd stay together. They would be really fully working together in harmony, but we're not quite there. But it's basically, it's a little flash. It's a little prelude, preview. They're going through the steps. Esav is going through the steps in his personal life, what's going to be at the end. So with Esav, we see the rectification of the nations. And then there's another step. What does Jacob then turn to? The animal world. Even the animals are going to be elevated in the days to come. Even the animals will have to be treated on a higher level, because they themselves will be on a higher spiritual level in the days in the end of days, the Messianic era. As is well known, that it says that predatory animals will no longer harm other animals at the end of days. The lion and the wolf will sit down with the calf, as is well known from Isaiah, if I'm not mistaken. So this is what Jacob is doing. He's turning from a meeting that's rectifying the nations to the animal and the natural world. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And where in the sukkah? In the sukkah, right? So I want to stop now. We'll talk more about that, about the sukkah, a little bit later. I wanted to go just discuss now about this idea of rectifying nature and about what this means and how important this really is and why this is really one of the main messages that we should walk away with from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Let's think about this for a second. What are we doing on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? What are we really trying to do? What's the main thing? What do we talk about so much? God is the king, right? We talk about God as king. What exactly is a king? What is a king? He's a guy that sits in a big castle and collects taxes and buys big, lots of fancy clothes? No, that's not what a king is. That's not the point. Yeah, that's maybe some kings, but that's not the point here. The point here is that God is kind of like the leader of the world. He is he's taking care of the world, and he's instructing us how to go about doing that, right? I mean, basically, saying he's a king is saying that God has a plan for the world. He's overseeing and taking care of the world, and there's certain objectives he wants done with the world. So there's two things. In other words, he wants to accomplish certain things, and he also has the responsibility to protect the world. But he doesn't do it by himself. Does a king do everything by himself? No. He has ministers, messengers, servants. And what we're saying is we, mankind, the Jewish people in particular, and those that surround themselves with them, are those servants who are bringing about God's objectives in the world. That's what we're saying, that's who we are. When Rosh Hashanah and Kippur come, that's it. We go back to the idea that that's who we really are. What do we say so many times in the prayers? Rule over your world. Show yourself. Rule over it. What do we mean to say by rule over it? That you should be known here, and that the world should therefore be filled with harmony, should be filled with sanctity, should be filled with compassion, right? That's a world where God's revealed in the world. As the Ramchal explains so many times, he says when God, so to speak, distances himself with the world or hides himself, what does it mean to hide himself? There's more suffering, there's more cruelty, and so on. The more cruelty man brings into the world, and the more godlessness man brings into the world, the more God hides from the world, because there's a relationship. And we've given a lot of control. By the way, where does that come from? It comes from the first verse. What is Rosh Hashanah? Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of man. So I think it's important to remember, what is man? And we talked about it before. A man is in the image of God. Okay, what does it mean to be in the image of God? Man is a creator. Man has all the keys. Man has all the buttons. In other words, what we do affects the world, makes the world a more sanctified place, and brings blessing into the world. God said, it's going to depend on you. Your actions, if you follow my instructions, like we've read in the recent parshios, we read in the recent Torah readings the last few weeks. Moses instructs the people. What does he say? I put before you, right? Life and good, evil and death. They go together. The more, the Ramchal explains, the more good there is in the world, so the more we reveal God in the world, when we do his will in the world, the more blessing comes into the world. And when we turn away and we think, oh, that there's no God, and basically we're on our own, so God turns away actually. And then more suffering is brought into the world, etc., etc. That's why in the time the temple stood, all the nations gained from it. All the nations were more prosperous, because the temple brought God's presence into the world, because the people of Israel, in a revealed way, it was a center which said, we are the servants of God. This is what we're here in this world. We're servants of God. What is our capital? Our capital is the temple. That's who we are. Because of that reality that the children of Israel brought into the world, the whole world was blessed because of that. So we have to understand these things. And they're talking about climate change, and they're talking about worries in nature. Do more Torah and mitzvahs. Do more good, bring more good into the world, and bring more blessing into the world. That's our first job, most important job. But there's also other ways that the issues with climate change actually intersect with the mitzvah of how we need to relate with nature. So we're going to get to that. So first of all, as I said, so the idea of Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu, let us make man in our image, means just like God is a creator. And the angels were given the job of what? Bringing down God's vitality into the world. And bringing acting upon God's instructions as how to order nature and how so that life should continue, all the systems of life, right? Who is the Talmenu in our image? The angels. So human being is given that power of God and the angels to literally move the wires around and press the buttons as to whether the world will be a blessed place or not a blessed place. God forbid. So the fact is that the foundation of the mitzvah of not causing harm to animals, or I should say generally, it's the mitzvah of not to misuse the world, stems from man's relationship to the world. What is man's relationship to the world? Man is the main subject. We are the ones who have been instructed, empowered with bringing about God's objective, which is the rectification of the world, which is the elevation and purification, so to speak, of the world. Ourselves, the rest of humanity, and the entire natural order and kingdom. So because of that, immediately in that first verse in Genesis, if you go back to it, it's a fascinating thing. It says in that very same verse, and I'm talking about in Genesis chapter 1, chapter 1, verse 26. Wow, it's so funny. Verse 26 is, the numerical value of the ineffable name is 26, I think. But in any event, it says here that let us make man in our image, right? And he should rule over the fish, the birds, etc. So there's a connection between the rulership and the image. So in other words, man's rulership has to do with the fact that he's made in the image of God, meaning that he is a creator. That because we're here, we're the ones who are supposed to bring about this objective of God that gives us the right to make use of the world and to be the leader, kind of director of things, and when we need to make uses of the world for our needs. Think about it this way. A royal servant, right? He enters one of the king's villages. He has a right to, take over maybe a certain property and demand assistance from the peasants there and demand that they give food and so on because he's a royal servant, similar to the idea that, when a military makes a barracks in the king's town, that they could demand food, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the idea here. Because we're God's servants of the king, therefore, we've been given the privilege to make use of the rest of the natural world. They go hand in hand. So the difference between the Torah view and the modern environmentalist view is that we're not equal because we're sentient beings. So we're not equals with nature. Man, particularly in his proper state as a servant of God, is above nature. Above the animal world and so on and so forth. As man is a subject and the driver of creation towards its objective. And man has the ability to make moral choices. Also, part of the fact that man is in the image of God. So that's where it stems from. Of course, one of the things that the outgrowth of that is that if a human being is not doing that, not using the world towards the service of Hashem and towards the rectification of the world, then it's a kind of a theft then, isn't it? What right does a person really have to make use of the world just in order to satisfy their own pleasures for no other reason? Everyone, human being may have a right. Similar, again, think of it in terms of our parable. A servant of a king, look, you need your time off. A person needs a little bit of rest, a little bit of space, maybe even a little bit of entertainment for their health, so they can work better the next day. That's understandable. But when that becomes the end, not a means, then that becomes really kind of like a type of theft. And the reality is, as our sages say, what makes a person better than a gnat? A gnat was created first. So if a person is only seeking to satisfy themselves in the world, I'm not saying according to the laws of Noah, it's literally a theft, but there's an ethical element of theft there in their use of the world. We have to understand that. But what is the law exactly that was given to Noah and to all of mankind regarding nature in more of its practical application? So we know that Adam was not allowed to eat any sentient beings, not allowed to devour and satisfy his hunger from eating animals. Adam was a herbivore. He didn't eat animals. In fact, all animals at that time, none of them were predators according to the Torah. So what happened after the flood? Things changed, and Noah was permitted to eat the flesh of animals. Now I want to tell you something that I'd like to suggest. Also, I didn't see anywhere, but I believe that makes a lot of sense. Why was there this change? So if you think about it, it says about Adam, it says that God commanded him to guard the Garden of Eden. He was supposed to work the land and watch over it. Ethically, that gave him the right to do what? Eat from that he was supposed to guard over and protect, right? He was supposed to enhance the Garden of Eden and so on, and he was permitted to eat from all its fruits. Noah was different. Noah was able to go on another level. Why? What did Noah do? He saved all the animals of the world from destruction, didn't he? That gave him the ethical justification to then demand from their offspring. But it wasn't come from him. It was a demand. It was a divine instruction and decree that now, after the flood, you can also eat from animals. As I said, I didn't see this anywhere, but I believe that it's true, because it makes sense, according to Torah principles, that because Noah saved them, it gave him a certain ethical right to then make use of animals for consumption. This is very similar to an idea of Rav Kook, Zatzal, Rav Abraham Isaac Kook. You could say maybe that's where I got the idea, where he says that one of the reasons why the Torah permits domestic animals, particularly, is because since man is taking care of them, he has some right to also make use of them, because you're sustaining them and so on, and they live under a man's protection. He has some rights to make use of them more than he does with wild animals. So Noah had that right with all the animal kingdom because he saved them all, correct? Okay. Now, what exactly is the law that in terms of how does mankind have to treat animals? So the verse talks about how Noah is forbidden to consuming the limb of a living animal. So I want to tell you a general rule in the Noahide law. There are two opinions among the rabbis as to how to understand Noahide law in general. I'll explain what I mean. One view is that the Noahide law is completely independent from the 613 commandments that were given to the children of Israel, to the Jewish people. They're separate and they have their own particular structure. You cannot relate one to the other, even though within the 613 there's similar laws, but you may not really be able to draw any analogies necessarily from the two. But the 7 laws are general categories, and whatever may rationally relate is included. So that's one way of looking at the 7 laws that the sages and great Torah scholars of Israel understood. The second approach is that of the 7 laws, any of the 613 that falls within the category also applies to that particular law. So that would mean as follows. In terms of this particular mitzvah of not cutting off and eating the limb of a living animal, according to the first opinion, it's a broad category of the following. It's forbidden to cause an animal unnecessary and unreasonable suffering. It's also forbidden to misuse or waste natural material. Okay? Now, it's true that there are laws among the 613 that are similar to that, but according to this first opinion, we have a general rule, which then the Noahide code itself has to expand. In other words, basically what we're saying is that human reason then has to apply this rule to its circumstances. That's what we're saying. We have a general rule from Hashem. Of course, we can look into the Torah to see how to apply it. We can look at Jewish law if we want to, but Jewish law is not binding. Okay? The second view is that in any case where we see a Jewish law similar that fits into the category, it needs to be applied. I'll give you an example. It's well known that there's a law within the 613 that if one sees donkey of his fellow struggling under the weight of the packages of its bags, you're required to go and assist. So the commentaries say one of the explanations for this mitzvah is because of the pain to the animal. In that case, that would create a requirement under those circumstances for also a non-Jew, one of the nations, to also assist the animal in those circumstances. Fascinating, because usually we say we're not supposed to cause any cruelty. But under the second rubric, it would even apply in certain situations to require a non-Jew to assist also save an animal from pain and suffering. So the general rule is that, I'll break it down as follows. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he says that the mitzvah or the prohibition of causing pain to animals can be broken down into the following elements. It depends on the reason. If you have a very good reason, in other words, you have a reason that, for example, let's say for a mitzvah, or let's say for human survival. So it's a very strong grounds for the use for causing pain to the animal, and that pain is necessary, or at least it would be highly unreasonable to require the person not to cause that pain in order to bring about the objective needed, then it'd be permitted to cause an animal pain. So in other words, how big is the need? To what extent is it really necessary to cause that pain? So you're weighing the different elements. That's what you're allowed to do. So therefore, let's look at the very embodiment of the law here. Cutting a limb from a living animal and eating it. There's no need to do that. The animal can be slaughtered first in some way, can be killed first so that it doesn't feel that pain and shame and horror of living and seeing, its own flesh being devoured. Just a horrible, cruel thing. And so therefore, there's absolutely no basis for it, even though the need is great, actually. It's an interesting circumstance because the need would be human consumption, let's say hunger. Still would be forbidden because the animal could be killed first. So there's no need to eat the flesh while the animal is alive. it's also brought that mystically speaking, that, and this explains why, by the way, why is it that the flesh of a living animal is forbidden to be eaten after the animal is even killed? In other words, let's say somebody, God forbid, cuts off the limb of a living animal, then the animal dies. That limb remains. You're still not allowed to eat that limb. Okay? And by the way, this is very important for the B'nai Noach community, or being meticulous in the 7 laws. If there are companies out there that may mix in such limbs into their food, the question is, do you have to be careful to avoid eating from such processors? So in other words, even those of you who don't eat kosher meat or don't, do that chumrah, that astringency for no hides, that's not required. But what would be required, if certain meat, would be mixed with a significant portion of it, well, literally, according to the law, it would be the majority. So that means 51%. 51% of the meat would be from meat that was cut from living animals. The whole thing would be forbidden. You couldn't eat it. Okay? Now, what if it's less than that? So then, according to Torah law, since it's an issue of doubt, it'd be permitted. Obviously, would there be a mitzvah to be machmir? Would be a mitzvah to be stringent and avoid it? Obviously, the answer is yes. Would be a mitzvah to avoid eating from such meat. And on the Jewish law, it's a 1 out of 60. That there's a stringency of that. If there's 1 out of 60% of that thing, we don't eat it. But in any event, the question is, why is this so? Why is it forbidden to eat the limb of a living animal after the animal is already dead and the suffering's over? So what does it matter? So one of the reasons is given mystically is because the limb of a living animal, it seems to retain some of the animal spirit of the animal itself, and that can't be properly integrated into a human being. So even though a non-Jew is permitted to eat blood and permitted to eat bile and things like that of animals, there's no prohibition for a non-Jew to eat or drink blood. In other words, you're not obligated to salt or anything like that. There's no such obligation. However, the living limb, that's just too much. In other words, that has too much of an impurity. Even in regarding to the rest of mankind, that's absolutely forbidden, because that's also a level that taints the neshama of the Ben Noach. Okay. But to get back to, I got a little off course. I want to go back to the 3 elements of Moshe Feinstein, because it's important. So we have a very important need, okay? And the pain to the animal can't be avoided, that'll be permitted. The pain to the animal can easily be avoided, that's clearly forbidden. If it be difficult, if there's a great need, the need would still trump the pain to the animal. The pain would be permitted because the need would be so great. If the need is not that great, it's a minor need, that would only permit a minor amount of suffering for an animal. If there is no need at all, and he gives the example, or if the behavior is contrary to Torah, then no pain at all to an animal is permitted. So those are the 3 steps. Should I say that again? So I'll say it again because this is important. This is literally, as we say, halacha lamaisa. This is actual for a person's, day-to-day behavior interaction in the world. Number 1, if there's a very great need for human survival or for human living their life, and it's deemed a great need. How exactly do you measure a great need? Obviously, the basics is food, clothing, and shelter. So to use an animal for work, to use an animal for food, to use its hide when needed, then pain to the animal would be permitted. However, I'll give you an example. If the act causes great pain and cruelty to the animal, but it's not very much needed, it's forbidden. For example, if an animal would be skinned alive, God forbid, in order to use its fur, that would be forbidden. Because the need of its fur, particularly nowadays, is not a great need. And therefore, we can use other things. And not only that, the only reason it has to be done while it's alive is because it retains a certain softness, which because of the after the animal's death, it doesn't retain. That's just not important enough. Rav Moshe Feinstein famously forbade eating veal because he said that is something that is not needed. Same thing with foie gras, I could pronounce it, also forbidden. Another interesting thing, evidently in some cultures, the testicles of certain animals are eaten, that they're cut off from a living creature, a living bull, let's say, and eaten. That is absolutely forbidden. That's Ivra min achai, forbidden to be eaten. Okay, so the idea is very serious need for food, and the pain can't be avoided. It's definitely permissible. If it's a very great need, for example, let's say somebody is starving and they don't have the skill to kill the animal in the most humane way. They don't know. They could wait to see if maybe some person will come along to where they live, but they may risk starving to death. In that case, they'd be permitted to beat the animal or whatever in order to eat it to save their life. You understand? So in other words, there's a weighing of the different needs. If the person's life is at stake, then a lot more pain to the animal will be permitted under those circumstances. Now, I want to point out that, I was thinking about this, and you realize if you really want to be careful with this, how much do we eat do we really need to eat? Maybe you think I'm being extreme here, but a lot of what we eat actually makes us unhealthy. So what right do we have to overeat and therefore consume more, and therefore more is produced when in fact we don't need it? So if the extra food makes us healthier, or maybe even makes us give us a little bit of, it makes us feel a little better emotionally, there may be some place for it. I also like to mention that it's permitted to slaughter the animals for the person who is the butcher or the slaughterhouse, because that helps them make a profit and provide jobs, etc. That also is a permissible human need. Again, but that needs to be weighed against to what extent does the person have to make the animal suffer in various ways? To what extent can the person make the profit without making the animal suffer as much? What things can be avoided that won't cause a very significant economic loss to the business person? Well, so it's a very complicated weighing of things. So again, the second level is going to be minor need, minor pain. An example is given in halacha from the old days of a person, they still do, obviously, down feathers, using feathers for pillows and various things like that. Is it permitted to pick the feathers off the duck or chicken while it's still alive in order to use a pillow? Again, this was a question of Jewish law in regards to the halacha of tsar balei chaim, the prohibition of bringing pain to animals, but again, it's subsumed within this category in the Noahide law. And the rabbis found it's forbidden, not allowed, because the pain was too great in reference, in relation to the need for that to be used in the pillow. Obviously, it's also possible to use slaughtered animals and take their feathers. Why do you have to do it in this way? So the answer was because the farmer didn't need to slaughter the animal right now. So the slaughter might have caused them some loss. Interestingly enough, the rabbinic authorities still said it was forbidden because the pain was too great to the animal. So it's quite a complicated weighing, and I would say that each person should weigh to the best of their ability. But I would certainly say that nowadays that there's such an abundance of so many things and so many technologies that it seems like that it would be a mitzvah min hamuvchar. It would be really a beautifying of this mitzvah to try to refrain as much as possible from using unnecessary animal products that we don't need, because that increases the pain to the animal. Of course, you can argue that these producers are making these things anyway, and so on. But I think still in all, certainly gluttony in terms of eating, I personally believe that this should be taken into consideration, and we should be sensitive. That why are we, consuming an animal that we don't need? Especially if there can be an element of the third level. What does Rav Moshe say? Moshe says if what we do is contrary to Torah, it's forbidden to bring the animal pain. Well, if we're slaughtering animals to get fat, to be gluttonous, which is against the Torah, it's absolutely forbidden. To kill an animal to make a huge party to stuff oneself without it being for a mitzvah is absolutely, according to this, forbidden. If you're already satisfied, I don't see any other way to understand Rav Moshe's statement. The person's totally satisfied. All they're doing is they're making a party. In other words, I'm telling you, if someone would make a party for the purpose of lewdness, not only is it forbidden, the party is against the will of God, but the killing of the animals, cruelty to animals, because there's no justifiable reason. Again, in case I missed it, the reasoning, the rationale behind this is that the world belongs to God, and there's godliness at every moment that's being invested in the world to keep it going. And there's kind of there's an element of godliness in everything. And we have to approach the world accordingly. It's not just an object for our misuse. Being an attorney, I remember that in law school, one of the things we were taught was that as an owner, ownership is absolute, and you can destroy your own property. That's one of the signs of ownership, is you can destroy it. That's absolutely against halacha. You're not permitted to destroy your own property. You're not even permitted to harm yourself, because your body is also the property of God. What an idea. Truth is that I'm very emotional about that. Person's body belongs to God. We can't harm it. So what's seen, people want autonomy over their bodies. But if we walked around with this idea that, our body is royal property, what an uplifting idea. According to that, it would seem that even B'nai Noach, even the nations and Noahites, would be forbidden to do tattoos, to be honest with you. It appears that subsumed in this would be, it seems to me, that tattoos, you can ask your rabbis if this is the case. It seems to me, because there's no real purpose in it. There's absolutely no purpose. In fact, the only purpose would be counted to Torah would be some form of, arrogance or being cool or showing some type of toughness. And I don't see any valid purpose there, really, in making it. So you're harming your body with really no grounds for it. It's being done for medical purposes. A person fasts to repent in order to humble his body, or for health, no problem. If a person bloodlets for health, no problem. But to burn their body for no reason, it's absolutely forbidden. Again, no reason means no valid reason. Because it's a fad. A fad, maybe I'm talking from my point of view of life, but a fad is not a valid reason. What's the reason behind this? Not only that, it's similar to the customs of the pagans, and therefore it's contrary to Torah. I like to read to you some passages, because it's also known that one of the elements of Noahide law is also the development of character, and in any way that a law, anything that relates to one of the 7 laws that has to do with the refinement of character, is subsumed within that law. And I wanted to read to you some beautiful passages from the Sefer HaChinuch. By the way, before I forget, get this book. This book is amazing for the 7 laws. This man is an amazing scholar, Rabbi Shimon Dovid Cowan, and the name of the book is The Theory and Practice of Universal Ethics, the Noahide Laws. It covers in detail all the Noahide laws, both in terms of their rationale, the basis within Jewish thought, the actual halacha of what the do's and don'ts of all the 7, modern application, footnotes. It's a wonderful book. I really advise everyone to get it, and I plan on continuing to use it in the future. I've been planning on making use of it for this class. I have on occasion, but everything I've said in regards to the laws of not eating the limb taken from a living animal comes from this book, and so I hope he doesn't try to sue me. But it's a wonderful book. Now, in the book, he quotes statements from Sefer HaChinuch, also worth having in your house. Each one of you who are a Ben Noach, a righteous Gentile, you have absolutely no problem studying the basics of all the 613 laws and to examine how they may apply to the 7 laws. And it's worth doing. And the book Sefer HaChinuch, there are English translations. Basically, he codifies and counts all the 613 commandments and goes through a basic explanation, also gives some rationale for the laws. So from that rationale, you may be able to draw some things of how you can apply to your lives as well. Those same concepts and character traits that he explains should be drawn from the mitzvot. In any event, see if I can find these paragraphs. Yes. 73. Okay. Oh. So this is what the Sefer HaChinuch says about the prohibition of cutting off and eating the limb of a living animal. He says, amongst the roots of this commandment is that we should train ourselves in the attribute of cruelty, that we should not train ourselves in the attribute of cruelty, which is an extremely negative quality. Okay? Let me say that again because I misspoke it a little bit. Amongst the roots of this commandment is that we should not train ourselves in the attribute of cruelty, which is an extremely negative quality. In truth, there is no greater cruelty in the world than one who cuts the limb or flesh of a living creature whilst it is still living in front of one and eats it. And I had already written a number of times the great benefit for us in acquiring good characteristics and removing ourselves from bad ones. For good cleaves to good, and the good God desired to confer benefit and therefore commanded to choose good. So in other words, what he's saying is that one of the ways that we can become close to God is by being good, by being compassionate. Because since that's one of God's essential attributes, if we behave in that manner, we emulate him, we become close to him. If we become close to him, then what happens? Then, as I said before, then God also benefits the world that his goodness is conferred onto the world, right? And particularly on that particular person. Because the essence of good is God the Creator himself. So the closer we get to him, the more good we confer on ourselves, and therefore wherever we go, wherever we do, if people come in contact, since we're closer to God, people around us become closer to God too, even in an indirect way. And that way we bring blessing on everyone around us. So when we walk around and we're in the presence and we think, I'm a princely servant, and I have to behave accordingly. In this situation, what am I being instructed right now at this moment? That means that we're walking with God all the time. He's with us, and being that he's with us, it touches others too in ways that we don't even understand and know about. So in other words, what I'm bringing to you is the concept that a righteous person brings blessing even if he doesn't even missionize, he doesn't even teach, he doesn't do anything except act accordingly wherever he goes. He still brings blessing to his surroundings, even if he just behaves himself, just himself. And that's the idea the Chinuch is saying here. So he's saying that there is an intellectual reason, based in character improvement, why it's forbidden to do this act. And obviously it means everything similar to it. Now I want to read you another passage, which is absolutely amazing. This is in regards to the mitzvah of what's called in the vernacular in the Jewish community, Baal Tashchis. Baal Tashchis. It's forbidden to destroy something. In other words, without reason to waste. It's forbidden. Okay? So the Sefer Chinuch gives an explanation for this mitzvah well. Again, this is subsumed in the prohibition that we've been talking about for the children of Noah of the severed limb. Okay? Even to destroy, as I said, to be wasteful of the material, of the resources of the world. So, it says the following. The root of this commandment is known, namely to teach our souls to love the good and the beneficial, as a result of which the good will cleave to us, and we shall be distanced from all bad things and from all manner of destruction. Then he goes on to say this. This is the way of the pious and men and women of deed. They love peace. They rejoice in the well-being of the creatures and draw them close to divine teaching, and will not destroy even a mustard seed of the world. Something, huh? He says not that a righteous person doesn't even want to destroy a mustard seed. So stop that fidgeting at the table, kids. No more ripping papers and squishing little beans or food at the table. Cut it out. Not good. But I'm very serious. But it just brings so much profundity to life when we really apply this rule constantly, that we want to be a giver of life in the world, that we don't want to be a destroyer. We want to be an element that brings vitality wherever we go. Obviously, that means to, if we can, bring happiness to people. But it also means, even to nature, to be respectful, to nurture things of nature if we can. Certainly, most importantly, not to destroy the natural world wantonly, wastefully, just in order to get, the pleasure of its destruction. That's a terrible thing. We should seek the well-being of the whole world. And that's really the command. What is the command? The command is to bring about the world's rectification. So in that case, the only things that we should be allowed to destroy, and this is the halacha also from Ben Noach, is we can destroy things if it brings to an advantage in the world. In other words, if we need to take from natural resources and it primarily helps in some way, that will be permitted. But if the outgrowths are particularly negative, then we have a problem. So in other words, this really is very relevant today in our world of technology and industry. It's been relevant for hundreds of years. But industrial waste, toxic waste, and things like that. So the need for the industry has to be weighed against the waste it creates. Overall for the world, is it an improvement, or is it, if you add it up, does it cause more damage than it does improve it? We really have to think very carefully about our technology. I don't know what to do about it, but I'll be honest with you, I think that a lot of it is counter to Torah. Meaning to say, how much do we really need? Well, right now, the way the world is structured, we need cell phones and things like that. I guess I couldn't be having this class right now. It wasn't for computers. I guess there's a point there. So I guess there's a need. But, you have to ask yourself you really have to ask ourselves this question long and hard. Because the waste of computers is very toxic. The materials, the wires, and even if you say that there's a need to have it, but the constant upgrades and constant improvements is, it's really unneeded. It's not needed. And obviously, in the end of days, the entire workings of our culture are based on continuous profit. I don't know how it's going to change, ladies and gentlemen, but something has to change. Because, again, basically what I'm trying to say is that at what point do you say that the need for profit is outweighed by the harm that we're causing to the world. I can't be the judge of that. I'm really not qualified. But I'm bringing up just the idea that these conveniences that we have, obviously we need medicines and we need to travel and so on and so forth, and we need so many things of technology. But the things of technology that are more for a luxury and that cause harm to the environment, it would seem to me just common sense that we need to question those. Are those really, is that sufficient, rationale? Is that sufficient grounds for us to create and develop these things when you weigh it against the waste and harm to the environment? And so I'm not saying I'm afraid the world is going to come to an end. That also, by the way, is forbidden. We know, well, it's also just foolish because God promises Noah that from here on in, the seasons will continue and that the natural process will continue until the end of the earth. So there's nothing to worry about. In other words, we can cause harm, but only up to a certain extent because God is in charge of the world and he'll see his objective met no matter what. We can't end this world, even if we try. Whoever tried to do so, they wouldn't succeed. One way or another, they would not succeed. Couldn't happen. I don't know how God will be able to do this, but I know that it's impossible. And I also believe that any harm that mankind can bring and has brought about can be undone. I believe that, I'm being a little provocative here, but I honestly believe, based on Torah sources, we know that for every plague, there is a cure within God's world. And since within God's nature, radioactivity can be created and toxins can be created, there must be a cure within nature. Not some crazy thing man has to pull out of something, of DNA or whatever that never existed before. But there's something here on this planet, something natural that can correct these harms that man have done. I know it. In any event, so this is really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a constant weighing and sensitivity to the world, sensitivity to people, and the sensitivity and really an aversion for any destruction. And whenever we destroy, it should only be with, really, the destruction is not the purpose. The purpose is to bring about a worthy further goal. We do need to destroy something. We need to end the life of an animal or whatever it needs, that it should be for a worthy purpose. I want to add some other laws, and I know we have to end, and it's the holiday, so I really can't continue much longer. There's a lot more to say. And I recommend that you, again, get this book, and it goes through so many interesting details about all the laws, but particularly this one. I'll just say one more thing that about putting animals to sleep. Interesting. You are permitted to put a pet to sleep, and the reason it is because of the costs and the nuisance and so on that can cause the human being to sustain the animal. Okay, so that's how the Torah law looks at it. I know that it's common that people want to put an animal out of its misery. They don't want it to continue to suffer, and that's commonly the humane feeling about it. But evidently, halakha looks at it differently. Halakha looks at it as follows: we don't have the right to take the life of anything for any reason. We can't make assumptions and be the judge of whether the animal's pain is so much that you'd rather die, or I think we don't have really the right to do that. What we do have the right to do is because of our superiors, because of our superior status as the ones that, again, are royal servants, as I explained, that based on human need, that would be, and does, obviously permits us to put an animal to sleep because you're reducing the pain to the animal to an absolute minimum, almost nothing. And therefore, to avoid the continued costs and both in terms of effort and money and so on of sustaining the animal, one is permitted to put the animal to sleep. However, again, if the killing of the animal would cause greater pain, that begins again. You have to look and start weighing again. To what extent and so on and so forth. So, in other words, what we're saying is that a human being, even though we've given certain possessory rights over the world, they're always conditioned, and God always has the right to revoke them. And that every life is sacred, and really without justification or with our own, we can't prophesize and take the life of any creature based on our own ideas, but only based on Torah and based on human need, which is really divine need. Okay, thanks for listening.